Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called The Biggest Bands of All Time. And it's not my decision, this is going to be based upon sales. So what I have done is I've taken from Wikipedia the list of the biggest selling artists of all time. I've taken all the solo artists out and you're just left with bands. Because I think when you do that, some really interesting things start to emerge. And one of the things that emerges is actually the styles of music that are covered by bands. When you start to look at the top 10 solo artists of all time, we're pretty much left with pop music. I can tell you who the top 10 solo artists of all time are. At number 10 we got Celine Dion, number 9 Whitney Houston, number 8 Taylor Swift, number 7 Mariah Carey, number 6 Eminem, so we have rap represented in there, number 5 Rihanna, number 4 Madonna, number 3 Elton John, number 2 Michael Jackson, and number 1 Elvis, who of course is rock, he's rock and roll. What's interesting looking at that is we've got one rap artist in there, Eminem. We've got one British artist, Elton John, albeit the third biggest selling artist of all time, with 250 to 300 million sales. So thinking of that's what you get when you look at solo artists, let's start looking at the biggest bands of all time, right? And I've gone for the top 20. And as I go through it, I want to bring out some interesting facts here. And one would be the styles, the range of styles that are covered in this list, and also the amount of these acts which are British. Britain's a tiny little country out of hundreds and hundreds of countries in the world, and popular music is dominated by America. And yet, half of these artists are British or connected to Britain in some way. Actually, more than half are connected to Britain in some way when you start to look at the real details. So we kick off at number 20. From up in Sheffield, we have Def Leppard with 100 million album sales, right? This is a huge amount of sales we've got. Def Leppard emerged in the new wave of British heavy metal alongside Iron Maiden and Angel Witch and Diamond Head. Towards the mid-80s, under the production of Mutt Lange, they made an album called Pyromania, which went much more towards an American sound, and they then started to sell a lot of records. They almost represent that hair metal rock sound of the 1980s. So that's who we have at number 20. At number 19, with 100 million, there's a lot of artists around about the 100 million, and I've rounded these up. When they actually start to get in the details, the Doors have sold a little bit more, a few million more than Def Leppard. So this is the true list, it's not my list. So at 19 we have the Doors. The Doors for me represent American rock bands before the British rock bands have their influence, before we start to hear the distorted guitar and the heavy drums and the dominance of electric guitar and the influence of blues. This is really interesting, blues being a American form, how it's the British guys that sort of sell the blues back to America. But before that influence has kicked in, we have the Doors, which have a much more sort of crooner sound. The vocals are coming so much more from, say, singers like Frank Sinatra in a way, but with a sort of mad beat poetry thing going on. Much more emphasis on keyboards. The guitar sounds are really clean, and the drums are very, very light, almost jazzy, with a sort of jazz improvisation going on. The Doors, I think, are one of the greatest bands of all time, and it's really incredible when we look at this list that when we compare that to the solo artists with all the Celine Dion's and Mariah Careys, that we have a band here in the list that's made a track like The End. The End is for me one of the greatest songs of all time, and it's a dark and troubling tune with an insane psychedelic jam that just whips up, to a sort of dervish-like frenzy. And it's really interesting that when we start to look at the bands on this list, the music is so much more further out and avant-garde. At number 18, we have Dire Straits. So Dire Straits is a British band, although Mark Knopfler, the main guy, is from Ireland, who emerged in the 1980s. They're sort of somewhere between Bob Dylan and sort of Americana, but there's also a very English influence in there. One of the interesting things about this band is really built around Mark Knopfler's almost like Chet Atkins style guitar playing, and early hits like Romeo and Juliet, you know, really have, that's a really important component of them. I felt in the 80s, especially with the Telegraph Road album, which I can't remember the name of the album, but the album Telegraph Road on, is that album is almost progressive. It's almost like progressive rock. So and they are very, very eclectic. By the time they get to Brothers in Arms, they've surprisingly become a big MTV band, and they're selling absolutely millions of records. Really interesting band, but pulling in a lot of influences from British rock music in a really interesting way. You know, I think the British bands are interesting because of their take on American influences, and Dire Straits have a unique take on American influences. Anyway, at number 17 we have Santana. All right, and Santana have sold again 100 million records. Santana are really interesting for me because on this list there's a few bands that I would class as having very strong progressive rock influences, and some of them being progressive rock bands that are pretty high up on the list. With Santana, I think there is definitely progressive rock influences there in the 70s, but Santana are a jazz fusion band. In the 1970s, they're not only a jazz fusion band, but they're a heavyweight jazz fusion band. They're not on the light side of jazz fusion. They're actually pummeling a line which is much more closer to what Coltrane and Bitches Brew are doing. So of course, the Supernatural album that he released, you know, a few years back, sold so many millions. That's probably elevated him up the list, but I don't think anywhere near 100 million. So we have to factor in the amount of albums that Santana was selling in the 70s, and those were jazz fusion albums. So on this list, I would say we have a bona fide jazz fusion artist. Number 16, Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses, surprisingly, are on this list with the 100 million sales. For me, Guns N' Roses are one of the classic 80s rock bands. Appetite for Destruction is an absolutely brilliant album. I own it. I think it's a fantastic album. Did they really do anything after that first album? Their whole reputation is around one album. It's a little bit like Nirvana, but Nirvana have nowhere sold the amount of records to make our list, but Guns N' Roses have. It's fascinating. Obviously, there's a few albums after that, and I think they sold truckloads as well. But I think that really came down to probably a couple of hit records that were really MTV driven, nowhere near the sort of magnitude and artistic, you know, bomb that was Appetite for Destruction. Anybody who feels that that 80s rock hair metal thing lacked validity needs to go and check out that album. Of course, Guns N' Roses are a full-on American band. You know, of course their influences are coming from Britain, but it needs to be said that Slash is British. But whether I can claim this band as British, of course I can't, but I thought that needs to be mentioned. So, moving on to number 15, we have Bon Jovi, yet another of one of these 80s hair metal bands. You know, what can I say? We've got 3 on the list. It shows how much, in terms of rock music, how powerful rock music was as a popular music phenomenon in the 80s. This has completely gone from popular music. We have lost the importance of rock music, which I would say is blues-based, guitar-based music. We have lost that completely from popular music over the last 20-25 years. Right, so at number 14, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. This surprises me. This does. At number 14 with 100 million records, we have the Red Hot Chili Peppers. In the 80s, I was a huge Chili Peppers fan. They were a fringe band. This was something that I felt was quite obscure, with a sort of anarchic mix of punk rock and funk with insane slap bass lines, almost like Frank Zappa-esque guitar playing, dodgy lyrics that were unlike anything else that anyone was singing about, you know, somewhere between sort of hippiness and the Beastie Boys' first album, you know. This was a pretty obscure band to me. I can remember them coming over to the UK. I never got to see them, and I should have gone. But they played a small club around about 1987, just a few miles up the road. So for them to become one of the biggest bands of all time is an incredible thing. But of course, it's because of Blood Sugar Sex Magic, which is an incredible album, and the track off that was a huge hit record, Under the Bridge. See, as you get older, sometimes you have to just, when you're doing these videos, you have to pad out a little bit so your brain can catch up. Under the Bridge. And I always felt, after they did Under the Bridge, the sort of record companies turned around and said, look, you know, you can sell a lot of units if you can do more of these heartfelt, sort of middle-of-the-road songs, which they did many of. And at that point, I lost interest. But it is fantastic that actually, again, on this here, we have a band that is pulling their influences so much more wider and disparate than anyone on the solo music artists. And we have a, you know, this is where P-Funk and even jazz and fusion, there's a little bit of that with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, especially early on. Right, what do we have at number 13? Linkin Park. Of all those bands that we could have had, you know, we could have had Nirvana, we could have had Soundgarden, we could have had Alice in Chains, you know, all those sort of, you know, the answer to all those 80s metal bands, right? You know, the sort of, the I don't even say grunge because it's wider than grunge. It's bands that appeal to sort of the fed up middle class white youth of America as they sit in their big houses with their allowances feeling sorry for themselves. They can do that whilst listening to Linkin Park. As you can tell, I've never a huge fan of Linkin Park. I don't quite get it. I love Soundgarden. I love all the bands that they came from. But to me, it just seemed like the record company answer. I'm sure that's not the case and people are going to moan at me. But anyway, again, it shows how important rock music was in terms of popular music right up until the last 20 years. Right, let's move on. At number 12... representing Britain again, here we have another British band, Coldplay. I've got to say something about Coldplay now. What can I say about them? Coldplay. Back when I was playing with Robert Plant, I can remember playing a small venue in Leicester. Can't remember what it was called. And when we got there, the sort of people that were frequenting this venue said, oh, you need to come down on Saturday because there's this local band called Coldplay and they're absolutely amazing. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I've never gone anywhere where the whole audience is telling me about some unsigned local band and how great they are. And the name stuck in my mind. When they first emerged with the first album, yeah, there was some good songwriting there. They were a band and it wasn't my thing. It was a bit middle of the road. It's middle of the road. But somewhere along the line for me, they've signed a deal with the devil and sort of not even a band anymore. I have to be honest, when I did this list, I got to Maroon 5 and they were on the list. I thought, should I put Maroon 5? I thought, no, they're not a band. Oh, come on. They're not a band. You know, that's not a band. A band is a guitar, bass and drums and you stand up in the same room and you play and you rock. Right, and then we have Coldplay, but I put Coldplay on the list. Do you feel like that's enough talk from me about Coldplay? Right, number 11 we have Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac are not only a British band through and through, although they have that very strong Americana influence which comes through later on with Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, absolutely fantastic. I like Fleetwood Mac. I like the early Fleetwood Mac, I like the blues Fleetwood Mac, I even like Rumours. Yeah, it's a bit middle of the road, but the songwriting's so strong and the voices and harmonies are so beautiful. I love the rhythm section. I like Fleetwood Mac. And this is one of the bands on the list that has a link to my personal town, you know, is because there was a band from my town called Chicken Shack and Christine McVie started her career in that band. We shall move on to number 10. At number 10 we have Metallica. An out American band? I'm not so sure. Lars Ulrich, who's the real brains behind that, really is the architect for that band. He's not from the UK, he's from some European country that I can't remember right now. But I know that he had to come to Britain. He had to camp out on Brian Tatler's floor just up the road from here, from Stourbridge, because they took their sound from Diamond Head. So yeah, they're an American band, but my God, are they influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal? And not just influenced by listening to the records, they actually, you know, Lars came here and took it direct from the source. At number 10. At number 9, Aerosmith, another out-and-out American band. But would Aerosmith exist without Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones? You put those together and you mix them all up and it comes out with Aerosmith. I'm going to go a little bit faster. Number 8. Right, so what we're up to 150 million sales we're up to now with U2. U2 are not a British band. Don't let me think. Don't think that I think they are. They're an Irish band, a very proud Irish band, like Thin Lizzy, you know, another one of my favourite bands. I have a lot of respect for U2. I have a few albums by them. I think everybody does. They're an Irish band. They're not a British band. But I feel they are a product of the British music industry. This is a band that would have emerged from Ireland, like some bands emerged from Scotland, you know, and Wales, and had to go to London, like everybody does in this country, and get signed through Island Records, a British label. So although they're not a British band, I would say they are a product of the British music industry and the British music industry machine. So I'm going to claim them at half. Although I must state, because I don't want anyone from Ireland to get upset by this, they are an Irish band. Right. Number 7, the Rolling Stones. The first rock band of all time. Do I have to talk about the Rolling Stones? Been going for over 60 years. They define what rock music is. They are product of that incredible fertile music scene that emerged in London in the early 60s. Where people were fusing jazz, blues, rock and roll, even like traditional jazz, all together. Alexis Corner, Graham Bond, you know, Brian Auger, the Blues Breakers, all those. That is where I think rock music was created. You know, that bands like Cream that really defined what a rock band was. And I think this is the overall message of this, is that Britain has got a really, really important stake in worldwide popular music, but it's not because of our solo artists, it's because of our bands. I think that we created bands in this country. At number 6 we have, with 150 to 200 million sales, AC/DC from Australia. But of course Brian Johnson, their current lead singer, is British. And of course their roots are in Britain, and of course they came to Britain, you know, to our country to break through. I see them in their DNA being very closely related, but I'm not going to claim them. But I think there's a very strong influence on that band, British influence. And number 5, with 200 million sales, we have the Eagles, right? A beautiful middle of the road rock music. Okay, how much of the experimenting avant-garde weirdness is coming from the British bands? When we look at the American bands on this list, you know, we look at the Linkin Parks, we look at the Aerosmiths, we look at the Guns N' Roses, you know, how much are they experimenting compared to some of the British bands on that, which we are now going to cover in the last 4. So at number 4, with 200 million albums, we have Queen. And I'm going to claim Queen as not only a hard rock band, but I think at times a progressive rock band. Not full on progressive, but the influences are really strong there. At number 3, with 250 million sales, we have Pink Floyd. And I am going to claim them as a progressive rock band. And this is the 3rd biggest selling band in the world of all time. The 3rd biggest selling band in the world is a progressive rock band that has made albums like Umma Gumma. That to me is an incredible thing. At number 2, we have the mighty Led Zeppelin with 200 to 300 million sales. And at number 1, with 500 to 600 million sales, we have what you know is the biggest, greatest, most important band of all time, the Beatles. So what do we learn from this list? One of the things is it's how important bands are. and how a band, because of the chemistry, and I think this is what makes bands important, it's the chemistry between the people in that band. It's that being greater than the sum of the parts. And I think when you have solo artists, what you have with great solo artists is an artistic vision. You think of a Prince or you think of a Michael Jackson, there's an artistic vision there. But often that can get manipulated by record companies, it get channeled through. But with a band is a group of people, it's a gang. And that gang can have solidarity. And people identify with that band because they want to be part of the gang. And in doing that, they will let the band take them to places which they normally wouldn't go. Which is why I think bands are responsible for far more interesting music than solo artists are. And this list just bears that out. The other thing that's really interesting to me, which I've tried to get across, is half of these bands are British. So where do we come at the end of this video? I am proudly championing my country, right? And what I'm saying is Britain has played a huge part in popular music, and the part it's played is the creation of the band. And the band has always been responsible for the most exciting, innovative, genre-pushing, boundary-pushing music in the history of rock music. And I think the sad state of affairs that our music industry is in at the moment is because we have forgotten the importance of signing bands. And when we sign bands, we sign gangs, right? Especially when we sign gangs of kids that are not from privileged backgrounds, okay? Where you are hearing the voice of the street, which has been bundled together in something which has chemistry and has force. That is a wonderful thing, and that we can see in the Beatles personified, right? Bands are pretty important, and that was the point I wanted to make. You know, let's champion bands. Let's go back and sign bands. Let's go back and form bands, all right? The emergence of digital technology and computers has made it less essential for musicians to form a band, but there's a magic that gets lost. You lose the chemistry of people coming together with disparate influences and finding the magic of what happens when you put those disparate influences together. I could talk a bit about this a lot more, but I will stop there. If you find these sort of videos interesting, please like and share, because these videos where I talk about more esoteric stuff often don't do so well, and I think they're far more interesting to talk about this than just go through, you know, my favourite whatever albums. But I will do that as well, just to make sure people click the button and watch. And thank you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the next video.